The sky above northern France was a pale, bitter blue, streaked with the thin white scars of combat. A formation of silver bombers thundered eastward, their engines trembling the frozen air at 25,000 feet. Inside the cockpits, American gunners stared at the distance ahead. Germany, where death waited behind black puffs of flak and silver darts of Messerschmitts. Over their radios they could hear it. The Germans were laughing. Another wave of fortresses without proper escort. They sneered. We'll cut them apart before they reach the Rhine. And for months that was true. The Luftwaffe had ruled these skies, bold, experienced, deadly. They mocked the new American fighter, the Mustang, calling it a toy. Too fragile, too short-legged. A plane that would turn back long before the bombers ever reached home. But on this cold morning in early 1944, something was different. Those toys were still climbing, still coming, and they weren't turning back. From the horizon, sleek shapes appeared, dark noses, long wings, twin drop tanks glinting in the sun. The laughter stopped. The hunters had just become the hunted, and the P-51 Mustang was about to rewrite the air war over Europe. 2. Context, Background, Section 1. By late 1942, the skies over Europe had become a grinding machine of attrition. Britain's Royal Air Force ruled the darkness, striking German cities under cover of night. But the Americans, newly arrived, confident and eager, believed daylight bombing could cripple the Reich faster. Precision bombing, they called it. B-17s and B-24s, bristling with guns, would fly in tight formations and hit factories, oil fields, and rail yards with surgical accuracy. There was just one flaw. They had to reach those targets first. From England, the bombers could barely make it to the industrial heart of Germany, cities like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen, before running out of fighter protection. P-47, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires were fierce in combat, but heavy on fuel. Their escorts peeled away near the Dutch border, leaving hundreds of bombers to push on alone, deep into enemy territory. And that's when the Luftwaffe came. Veteran German pilots, men like Adolf Galland and Egon Meyer, waited until the escorts turned back. Then they struck, slicing into bomber formations with ruthless precision. The sky would turn black with smoke, and crews would count the parachutes of friends drifting toward captivity or death. The Americans knew they couldn't win the air war this way. They needed a fighter that could stay with the bombers all the way, in and out. Then came a promising prototype, the North American P-51, sleek, aerodynamic, built around a laminar flow wing that promised speed and efficiency like nothing before. But its Allison engine gasped for breath above 15,000 feet, the altitude of war. It was fast, yes, but useless where the bombers flew. So the Germans laughed. Let them bring their Mustangs, one ace reportedly said. They'll never reach us. But across the Atlantic, engineers and officers were already at work on something the Germans hadn't anticipated, an idea that would soon transform the Mustang from a footnote into a legend. The P-51 Mustang wasn't born from luck. It was born from science. When North American aviation began designing it in 1940, they ignored convention. Most fighters of the era were brute force machines, thick wings, powerful engines, short range. The Mustang was different. It was elegant. Its designers, led by Edgar Schmood, focused on airflow, crafting a wing with a laminar flow profile, where the air hugged the surface longer, reducing drag. This innovation made the Mustang faster and more fuel-efficient than any contemporary Allied fighter. It could cruise farther on the same fuel load and still have energy for combat. The sleek radiator scoop beneath its belly wasn't just stylish. It was functional. The Meredith effect used the engine's heat to generate a small thrust, offsetting drag. In the Mustang, even heat was turned into speed. But the brilliance of the design also lay in balance. Unlike the heavy P-47, the P-51 was agile and smooth at high speed. Its controls stayed light even at 400 mph, giving pilots confidence to push harder, dive faster, and climb away with ease. The Mustang was an engineer's dream turned into a pilot's weapon. Still, advanced design alone doesn't win wars. Without leadership willing to take risks and commit these machines where they mattered, the Mustang might have stayed another good aircraft on a test field. In 1943, the American High Command faced a brutal reality. Precision bombing was failing. The 8th Air Force, bleeding crews over Germany, needed a miracle, or at least a new plan. General Ira Eaker, then head of the force, believed in sticking to daylight raids. But his successor, the hard-driving General Jimmy Doolittle, believed something else entirely. To win the air war, you had to destroy the Luftwaffe first. That meant one thing: fighters that didn't just escort bombers, but hunted enemy aircraft wherever they hid. Doolittle tore up the old defensive doctrine. Instead of keeping the Mustangs tied close to bomber formations, he ordered them to roam ahead, to engage, to provoke, to dominate. It was a gamble. Many bomber crews initially feared it would leave them exposed, but soon the results spoke for themselves. Within weeks, the Luftwaffe began to lose its best men, not over their airfields, not in ambush, but in open combat against Mustangs flown by young American pilots who now held the initiative. Allied command had finally done what German leadership had refused to: adapt. Yet even the most daring strategy depends on an enemy's weakness. And the Luftwaffe's greatest weakness was invisible: arrogance. Through 1943, German fighter units watched the arrival of the P-51 with amusement. Many Luftwaffe aces, hardened by years of dominance, considered it an inferior design. They had beaten everything the Allies sent before: Hurricanes, Spitfires, P-47s. Why should the Mustang be any different? To them it looked light, even fragile. A sports plane, as some called it. Reports from downed pilots described it as fast, but underpowered. Early versions, after all, still used the Allison engine. The Luftwaffe command dismissed it as no threat. Their focus remained on intercepting bombers, not the escorts. This overconfidence would cost them dearly. When the Merlin-powered Mustangs began appearing in late 1943, German pilots didn't immediately notice. They saw the same silhouette. But this time, it didn't vanish at high altitude. It didn't turn back at the Rhine. And when they tried to dive away, it followed. By the time they realized what had changed, it was too late. The very machine they had laughed at was now cutting through their formations, claiming aces, and chasing them all the way home. The mockery had turned into silence, and that silence was the sound of the Luftwaffe's decline beginning. At 25,000 feet, war was a lonely place. Inside the bombers, crews counted minutes like hours. They called their escorts little friends, a phrase that carried both affection and desperation. Every man in those freezing fuselages knew what it meant when the fighters had to turn back. That moment, when the last silver shape peeled away toward England, the radios went quiet. The rest of the journey was a prayer. Many crews described those missions as a walk into hell. The flak bursts, the streaks of enemy fighters, the smoke of burning aircraft. Losses mounted so high that a man's odds of surviving 25 missions were barely 1 in 4. Then came the Mustang, and with it, hope. The first time bomber gunners saw the P-51 still circling above them over Germany, disbelief filled the intercoms. "They're still with us," one crewman shouted, tears freezing on his mask. The presence of those little friends changed everything. Morale soared. Crews that once doubted the mission now trusted it again. The Mustang didn't just guard their lives, it restored their faith that they could finish the war alive. And behind that restoration lay a single elegant innovation, something so simple that it redefined how far courage could fly. Sometimes history turns not on grand inventions, but on humble solutions. The drop tank was one of them. Before 1943, fuel limitations shackled every Allied escort. Engineers had tried larger internal tanks, complex plumbing, and even mid-air refueling concepts. None practical in wartime. The answer turned out to be lightweight aluminum cylinders that could be filled with fuel, slung under the wings, and jettisoned once empty. It sounded almost crude, but in practice it changed everything. With two 75-gallon tanks attached, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, and back again. Pilots could burn the drop tanks first, then release them before combat, freeing the aircraft to maneuver cleanly in a fight. At first there were problems. Leaks, ruptures, unreliable connections. But American field crews worked miracles. They improvised fittings, reinforced clamps, and turned the Mustang into a true long-range predator. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent. Their fighters remained tied to the homeland, unable to chase deep or intercept far. The drop tank gave the Allies more than range. It gave them freedom. The Mustang could now be anywhere, any time. And when freedom enters a battlefield, strategy itself begins to shift. Because soon even the idea of escort would change meaning entirely. Before the Mustang, Allied fighters had fought defensively. Protect the bombers, hold the line, survive the mission. But as 1944 began, everything turned. The moment those drop tanks came online, the orders changed. No longer were pilots told to guard. They were told to hunt. General Doolittle's doctrine was clear. The bomber offensive cannot succeed unless the German fighter force is destroyed. With that, the Mustangs fanned out ahead of the bomber streams, diving into enemy airspace to meet the Luftwaffe before it ever reached the formation. It was a psychological shock to German pilots. For the first time, they were reacting, not dictating. Their airfields were attacked, their takeoffs ambushed. The hunters' confidence eroded day by day. Yet for Allied pilots, this shift wasn't just tactical. It was moral. Many had watched bombers burn without being able to help. Now they could. The Mustang gave them a weapon and a purpose that felt righteous. To protect life by taking control of the sky itself. It was no longer about holding the line. It was about ending the nightmare. And as the snow melted over Europe in early 1944, the Mustang was ready to deliver that reckoning. The balance of power in the air was tipping, and soon one campaign would prove it beyond doubt. The winter of 1943 settled over Europe like a steel curtain, cold, gray, and unforgiving. But for the men of the 8th Air Force, it wasn't the weather that froze their veins. It was the mission orders pinned to briefing room walls. Penetrate deep into Germany, strike the aircraft industry, total commitment. It was February 1944, the beginning of Operation Argument, known among air crews simply as Big Week. The goal was brutal in its simplicity. Destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground and in the air, no matter the cost. For months, Allied bombers had bled without mercy. The German fighter force still stood strong, confident that any raid reaching central Germany would end in flames. But this week, things were different. The Mustangs were ready, their Merlin engines roaring, drop tanks full, and orders clear. Escort all the way to the target. On February 20th, as dawn broke over East Anglia, hundreds of bombers lifted from icy runways, climbing toward formation. Behind them rose the P-51s, long, sleek, and silent in the pale light. In the cockpits, the airmen knew the stakes. This wasn't just another mission. It was the largest air offensive ever launched in daylight. Factories at Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, and Augsburg were on the hit list, the very arteries of the Luftwaffe's production. As they crossed the Dutch coast, radar screens in Germany lit up. Alarms howled. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled squadrons from every direction, Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, and the few remaining twin-engine interceptors. By noon, the sky over Germany was a canvas of chaos. Contrails twisted, machine guns flared, and explosions dotted the frozen clouds. But something was different. The bombers weren't alone. From high above, the Mustangs swooped down like predators unleashed. They tore through intercepting formations before they even reached the bombers. Their long range and high altitude advantage made every German maneuver futile. Dive. The Mustang followed. Climb. The Mustang closed in. In one of those battles, American ace Major George Preddy scored multiple victories in minutes. "They didn't expect us to be there," he recalled. "They turned to run and realized too late we had the fuel to follow." It was the nightmare German pilots had once laughed off. A plane that could stay, fight, and still come home. Across radio frequencies, the disbelief spread. German ground controllers screamed for reinforcements. Pilots cursed as their engines overheated, diving for airfields that were already under Mustang attack. On the bomber channels, cheers replaced prayers. For the first time, the formations broke through to their targets and back with cover. The losses were heavy. Hundreds of aircraft were still shot down. But the tide was turning. By the end of Big Week, the numbers spoke for themselves. More than 10,000 sorties were flown in 6 days. The Allies lost nearly 250 bombers. But in return, the Luftwaffe lost over 350 fighters and, more importantly, their veteran pilots. The German air defense was bleeding out faster than it could recover. Every lost ace represented years of training the Reich could no longer replace. Inside briefing rooms in Britain, Allied commanders studied the combat reports. Doolittle's strategy had worked. The Luftwaffe had been forced into open battle, and it had lost. On the other side, in dimly lit hangars across Germany, mechanics worked silently among wrecked planes. The confidence that had once filled the Luftwaffe was gone. For the first time, they had seen American fighters over Leipzig, over Augsburg, even near Berlin. The joke about the short-legged Mustang was now a bitter memory. One Luftwaffe major wrote in his diary that week, "We no longer control the sky. They come from England, stay over our cities, and return unscathed. The air war is slipping from our hands." It was the beginning of the end, and it had been forged not by superior numbers alone, but by persistence, innovation, and a machine that refused to turn back. But the true reckoning, the moment the Luftwaffe would finally break, was still to come. The days following Big Week were eerily quiet over the English airfields. Pilots drank coffee in metal mugs, waiting for the next mission order. But across the Channel, chaos brewed. The Luftwaffe had been pushed to the edge, its best pilots gone, its airfields battered. Still, Göring demanded results. He ordered his remaining squadrons to intercept at all costs. By March 1944, the air war over Germany had turned into a deadly race for survival. The P-51 Mustangs now flew deep penetration raids almost daily to Berlin, to Hanover, to the synthetic oil plants at Merseburg. Every flight tested man and machine to their limits. On March 4, 1944, the unthinkable happened. American bombers, escorted by P-51s, reached Berlin. For the first time in the war, U.S. aircraft struck directly at the heart of Nazi power. Berliners rushed into shelters as air raid sirens wailed, not for the RAF's night bombers, but for American planes in broad daylight. Above the city, the Luftwaffe scrambled what it could, a few squadrons of Me-1009s and FW-190s. They climbed desperately into the sunlight, expecting to find isolated bombers. Instead, they found Mustangs. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group dived through a cloud bank and shot down 2 German fighters before they even saw him. Lieutenant Bud Anderson described the scene later. "They thought we'd turn back before Berlin, but when we showed up, you could almost feel the shock through the radio." For German pilots, the realization was devastating. The enemy had crossed the final threshold. The Reich's capital, once safe under layers of air defense, was now within reach, and there was nothing left to stop it. From March to May 1944, the Mustangs pressed harder. Their new strategy, fighter sweeps, sent groups of P-51s ahead of bomber formations to hunt the Luftwaffe before the bombers even appeared. These missions tore apart what remained of German Air Command. Young, inexperienced flyers were sent up to replace aces lost in Big Week. Most never came home. In one of the most intense engagements, Major John C. Meyer led his squadron into a swirling dogfight near Brunswick. Over the radio, he called out, "Let's clean up the sky, boys." Within minutes, they destroyed a dozen enemy aircraft. The fight was fast, merciless, and symbolic. Germany's elite was being erased in the clouds. By June, the Luftwaffe's ability to mount large-scale resistance had collapsed. Reports from German radar stations showed fewer and fewer formations responding. Pilots who once boasted hundreds of kills were either dead or grounded. Aircraft stood idle for lack of fuel, their engines cannibalized to keep others flying. Meanwhile, the Allies had achieved something beyond tactical success. They had achieved air supremacy. The sky above Europe now belonged to them. But the cost was not only in machines or men. It was in the psyche of a nation built on aerial pride. For years, the Luftwaffe had been the spearhead of German might, the invincible guardian of the Reich. Now it was hunted in its own airspace. One German ace, surviving a mission over Magdeburg, said later, "We saw them everywhere, in the clouds, behind the sun, above our airfields. The Mustang was like death itself, silent, fast, and always waiting." The P-51 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it humiliated it. What had started as a defensive escort plane had evolved into the most feared predator of the war. By mid-1944, the statistics told the truth that words could not. Luftwaffe fighter losses had reached unsustainable levels. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed every month, often with their pilots still inside. German production could no longer keep pace. The message to the Allies was clear. The air over Europe was theirs. The message to Germany was crueler. The sky that once protected them now belonged to their enemy. From that moment, every German soldier on the ground knew, if the Americans owned the air, invasion was inevitable. And as the summer sun rose over France, casting light over the Channel, the next phase of the war loomed on the horizon. The Mustang had not just changed the air war, it had cleared the way for D-Day. By the summer of 1944, the once mighty Luftwaffe was a shadow of itself. Its airfields lay scarred with craters, its hangars half empty, and its ranks filled with pilots who had barely finished training. The veterans, men who had fought since Poland and France, were gone, either dead or too exhausted to fly. The skies that once belonged to Germany were now ruled by strangers. For the Allies, this was the moment of transformation. Every mission that once required prayer now carried confidence. The P-51 Mustang, once mocked, now escorted bombers in daylight across the entire breadth of Europe, from England to Berlin and home again. It wasn't just range or speed, it was control. Control of altitude, of initiative, of morale. In briefing rooms across East Anglia, young Mustang pilots studied maps that stretched to the Elbe. They no longer spoke of turn-back points. Instead, they marked fuel checks for the return leg after Berlin. That alone told the story. Meanwhile, on the German side, despair deepened. The aircraft factories at Augsburg, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt, the heart of German production, were shattered ruins. Fuel refineries, especially those feeding the Luftwaffe, burned night after night under Allied bombardment. Even when planes could be built, they couldn't be flown. Aviation gasoline had become rarer than ammunition. Adolf Galland, once the hero of the Battle of Britain, warned Goering that the fighter arm was collapsing. "We are losing the war in the air," he said bluntly. Goering refused to believe it, but his men did. Each week brought fewer sorties, fewer victories, more funerals. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp edge of German conquest, now fought only to delay defeat. Many of its new pilots never survived their first mission. Training was rushed, flight hours were minimal. When they met Mustangs, the results were merciless. Allied pilots began recognizing patterns, the erratic climbs, the panicked turns, signs of inexperience. What had once been evenly matched duels were now executions in the sky. By mid-1944, the air over Western Europe was an Allied domain. Bombers flew with near impunity, striking targets that had once been unreachable. The German army on the ground looked upward and saw only the constant gleam of silver. Bombers above. Mustangs circling like hawks. It was more than tactical victory. It was psychological dominance. The Luftwaffe, which had once embodied German pride and invincibility, had been broken not just by machines, but by endurance, by pilots who refused to turn back, and by a fighter that lived up to every promise. In airfields across England, rows of Mustangs now waited for the next phase, the one that would bring the war to its climax on the ground. Because while the Luftwaffe crumbled, the Allies were preparing for something greater. The skies had been cleared. Now came the invasion. By early June 1944, the sound of freedom began to hum over the English Channel. The Allied invasion, Operation Overlord, was about to begin, and every ship, tank, and soldier depended on one thing: air superiority. Without it, the beaches of Normandy would become another Dunkirk. The P-51 Mustang made sure that didn't happen. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Mustangs and their crews worked relentlessly, sweeping across northern France in waves. They hunted down German reconnaissance aircraft, shredded rail lines, and strafed convoys trying to move toward the coast. Every mission had a single purpose: to blind the enemy before the invasion began. By June 6th, the Luftwaffe could barely lift a wing. When the first landing craft touched the sand at dawn, the sky was already owned. Overhead, hundreds of Mustangs circled, ready to dive on anything with a black cross. German pilots who dared take off from bases near Caen or Cherbourg barely reached altitude before being intercepted. Reports from ground troops described that sight again and again, the silver fighters patrolling endlessly, like angels of war, ensuring the sea below stayed safe. To the soldiers storming the beaches, that hum of the Merlin engine meant life. It was the sound that told them the Allies controlled the heavens. For every German gun nest that tried to resist, Mustangs were called in to silence it. For every advancing tank column, P-51s strafed the roads ahead, tearing supply lines apart. The air had become a weapon as decisive as any artillery battery. By the summer's end, Allied armies had broken through France, and the Luftwaffe's resistance had withered into scattered ambushes. German commanders began to admit what their pilots already knew. The sky belonged to America. Even Hitler's new wonder weapons, the Me-262 jet and V-1 rockets, arrived too late, too few, and too fragile to change the tide. For the P-51, victory wasn't measured only in kills, it was measured in miles. From 1944 onward, Mustangs escorted bombers over every remaining industrial target, Berlin, Munich, even deep into Poland. They returned again and again, unchallenged. The plane that once couldn't cross the Rhine was now flying over the Danube. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the statistics were staggering. Mustang pilots claimed more than 4,900 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, a record unmatched by any other Allied fighter. But their greater achievement lay in what they enabled: daylight bombing that crippled German industry and cleared the way for ground victory. In post-war interviews, captured Luftwaffe officers spoke of a single turning point: not D-Day, not Stalingrad. They said it came when the P-51 appeared over Berlin. That was when they knew the Reich could no longer defend itself. The Mustang's legend only grew after the war. Pilots who had flown her called her a dream with wings, and even enemy veterans admired her grace. She wasn't the most powerful aircraft ever built, nor the most heavily armed, but she was the perfect balance of everything that mattered: speed, range, and reliability. In the years that followed, she became the standard for what a fighter should be: a machine that combined beauty with purpose. Long after the guns fell silent, her silhouette remained a symbol of courage, precision, and endurance. The Luftwaffe's laughter had turned to silence. The skies they once ruled now carried the whisper of a single name: Mustang. The story of the air war was nearly over. Only one thing remained: to understand what it all meant, what this aircraft and its pilots revealed about the nature of war, innovation, and the human spirit at itself. 6. Reflection, closure. The irony of flight and the enduring spirit of the Mustang, approx. 380 words. When history looks back at the Second World War, it often remembers the great machines of destruction. The tanks that rolled across Europe, the bombers that turned cities to ashes. But among them, the P-51 Mustang stands apart. It was not born from fear or dominance. It was born from necessity. The irony is almost poetic. The aircraft that changed the war was never meant to be built in the first place. North American aviation had offered to design it simply to save time, and in doing so, created one of the most perfect flying machines of its age. The Germans had laughed at it. The British had improved it. The Americans had believed in it. And together, they turned it into the very weapon that ensured victory. The Mustang's true power was never just in its Merlin engine or its drop tanks. It was in what it represented: human adaptability. It showed that wars aren't always won by the strongest, but by those who learn fastest. In the cockpit of a P-51, a pilot could see more than clouds and contrails. He could see the shape of the future, of an age where engineering and courage intertwined, where distance was no longer a barrier, and where domination of the skies meant freedom on the ground. Even decades later, when jet engines roared into the modern era, veterans would still look to the Mustang with reverence. They remembered how it felt, the smooth stick in their hands, the vibration of the Merlin through the frame, the hum that told them they'd make it home. The P-51 didn't just win battles, it carried men through fear, through fire, through the very limits of endurance, and brought them back. Its story reminds us that greatness often begins in doubt, that laughter can precede awe, and that even the simplest idea, like a pair of drop tanks, can change the course of history. In the quiet skies of peacetime, when a polished Mustang arcs through the air at an air show, its echo still carries that lesson, a symbol of freedom, a machine of grace, and the plane that flew all the way home.